Mississippi, the land of magnolias, blues music, and a whole lot of poverty. Today, we're taking a deep dive into how this state went from being one of the wealthiest places in the US back in the 1850s to the nightmare that it is today. Back in the mid-1800s, it had massive cotton farms, loaded plantation owners, the whole Southern aristocracy thing, to, well, dead last in about everything that matters in 2025. We're talking poverty, education, healthcare, job opportunities, you name it. Mississippi is probably dead last or trading places here and there with West Virginia. So how did it all go wrong? From the Civil War devastation to the failure of Reconstruction to the rise of Jim Crow, a century of bad policy decisions, and the modern era brain drain. We're unpacking 175 years of decline with all the historical facts and facepalm moments you can handle. So buckle up, hit that like button, and maybe pour yourself some strong sweet tea, because this is the story of how Mississippi fell from the king of cotton to the cautionary tale of the South. Got it? Get it? Good. Let's take a look. Let's jump in the Wayback Machine to the 1850s, back when Mississippi was kind of a big deal. Forget Silicon Valley and Wall Street. If you wanted wealth, status, and the finest plantation house money could buy, Mississippi is where it was at. This wasn't just a Southern thing. Mississippi was one of the wealthiest regions in the United States thanks to its booming cotton industry. By the 1860s, Mississippi was the top cotton producing state in the country. If you were rich in Mississippi, odds are your money was soaked in sweat and built on the backs of enslaved people. The entire economy was a house of cards built on forced labor, monoculture, and good old-fashioned Southern arrogance. Life was good. I mean, if you were white and you owned land. If you were black, you were likely enslaved and making someone else wealthy. Mississippi's population was nearly 50% enslaved people by the time the Civil War rolled around, which tells you exactly how much the economy depended on human bondage. Spoiler alert, that wasn't going to end well. Then came 1861. The Civil War kicked off and Mississippi proudly jumped on the Confederate bandwagon. The state seceded from the Union like it was quitting a job they didn't like. Only instead of writing a resignation letter, it decided to go to war with its biggest customer, the northern states. The war obliterated railroads, destroyed cities, burned economy, ruined the entire system Mississippi had built. Slavery, plantations, cotton wealth went up in smoke. The Union Army wasn't exactly handing out stimulus checks, and when the war ended in 1865, Mississippi was left with a broken economy, no labor force, and the slow, horrifying realization that the old way of doing things wasn't coming back. So what did Mississippi do? Did it adapt? Did it innovate? Rebuild? Not really. Instead, the state spent the next several decades in full denial mode. Rather than embrace the opportunity to modernize its economy or diversify its industries, Mississippi doubled down on what it knew: cotton, racial hierarchy, and nostalgia for a system that no longer existed. Wealthy landowners, now bitter and broke, still clung on to the fantasy that their pre-war lifestyle would somehow be resurrected, minus the whole losing the war part. With slavery outlawed, they pivoted to sharecropping, which was basically just a rebrand version of economic bondage. Formerly enslaved people were freed on paper, but quickly found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt, poverty, and exploitation. It wasn't just a bad system, it was a rigged system, designed to keep wealth and power in the same white hands that had lost the war but refused to lose control. Meanwhile, the rest of the country was slowly marching into the industrial age. Railroads were being rebuilt, cities were growing, and new industries were taking root everywhere except Mississippi. Here, progress was considered suspicious, education was underfunded, and political power was used to preserve the past rather than plan for the future. It wasn't just an economic collapse, it was institutionalized stagnation. Mississippi didn't just fall behind, it actively avoided catching up. Reconstruction should have been the reset button, a chance to build something new. But Mississippi took one look at the idea of racial equality and said, nah, we're good here, thanks. Freed Black Americans tried to gain political power, own land, and live free lives. They ran for office, built schools, opened businesses, and dared to believe that the promise of emancipation might actually mean something. For a brief moment during Reconstruction, Mississippi saw a flicker of progress. Black legislatures were elected, new constitutions were written, and federal troops provided a thin line of protection. But that moment didn't last. White supremacists responded in the way they always have when equality comes knocking, with violence, intimidation, and a complete rejection of democracy. Voter suppression here wasn't subtle. We're talking poll taxes, literary tests, and outright terrorism. And if that didn't work, lynching usually got the message across. The Ku Klux Klan and other violent groups flourished, operating with near total impunity. Within a few years, Reconstruction governments were overthrown and replaced by former Confederates who had all the progressive vision of a rusted out tractor. Economically, the state limped forward like a three-legged mule. With slavery gone, the solution wasn't innovation or investment, it was sharecropping, a system specifically designed to keep black families tied to the land permanently in debt and one bad harvest away from starvation. White landowners got rich and everyone else got the same raw deal, just with a new name. And since Mississippi insisted on keeping cotton as its one and only cash crop, it was completely at the mercy of global commodity prices, boll weevils, and bad luck. The education system, nearly non-existent for most, and downright hostile towards black communities. Schools for white children back in the day were barely funded, and for black children, they were often one-room shacks with no books, no heat, and teachers who were paid in hope and cornmeal. Infrastructure was a joke. Rural roads turned into mud when it rained, bridges collapsed and stayed collapsed, and indoor plumbing was considered a luxury for half the state. But none of that seemed to matter to those in charge. The unofficial motto for the state at the time should have been, as long as we're not equal, we're happy. And that mindset, it didn't just shape the next decade, it laid the foundation for a century of institutional decline. Mississippi wasn't just behind the curve, it was building a permanent home in last place. Living in these small towns means you don't have to be around the chaos we are currently having with ICE raids and protests. Yesterday, New York City's comptroller was arrested for interfering with an ICE arrest. Whether you saw this story or not depends on where you lean politically, because it is mostly being covered by left and center news sources. On the right, not so much. If you stick to one news source, you're only getting one side of the story. I know this thanks to Ground News, the sponsor of today's video. Ground News was founded by a former NASA engineer to make it easier for readers to compare news coverage and think critically about the news they consume. They show you which sources are covering the story and where they fall on the political spectrum, so you can make sure you're seeing the full picture. When I first started reading Ground News, it kind of opened my eyes by seeing both sides. For example, you could see that this story about the comptroller being arrested is only being covered by one right-leaning news source, the New York Post. And that's probably because it's in New York. I also really like the blind spot feature that shows you stories that aren't being covered evenly. I think everyone should use Ground News because it's no longer a rumor the media is biased. If you read the comment section of any of my videos, I'm sure you're going to come across at least one time I've suggested someone read Ground News. It's normally when they make some political statement and it's obvious they only get their information from one news source. So you could go to ground.news/Briggs for a better way to stay informed. Subscribe for 40% off unlimited access to worldwide coverage through my link, or you could use this fancy QR code. Once again, thanks to Ground News for supporting this video. Now back to it. The early 20th century brought a bit of industrialization to some parts of the South, but Mississippi mostly missed that memo. While places like Birmingham and Atlanta dipped their toes into manufacturing, Mississippi doubled down on agriculture, specifically cotton, again, and continued to ignore things like economic diversity and public education. And then the boll weevil showed up. Yep, a tiny insect basically brought Mississippi to its knees. The boll weevil infestation of the 1910s and 1920s wiped out cotton yields. Suddenly, this state that was all in on one crop had nothing to fall back on. Jobs were scarce and education was still a joke. Healthcare was practically non-existent also, and just to make sure the state didn't get too comfortable, the Mississippi River flooded in 1927 and caused one of the worst natural disasters in American history, displacing hundreds of thousands of people, mostly poor and black. Here's a fun fact: if you were already poor, the Great Depression didn't change much. It just confirmed your suspicions about the universe. Mississippi was already broke before the 1930s. By the time FDR rolled out the New Deal, Mississippi was basically in permanent economic ICU. Sure, the Works Progress Administration and Civil Conservation Corps created some jobs, but racism made sure that black workers got scraps while white landowners benefited the most. World War II offered a tiny breath of hope. Military bases were built, and some Mississippians found jobs in war industries. But as soon as the war ended, the factories closed and it went back to poverty as usual. While the rest of the country was experimenting with highways, suburbs, and rock and roll, Mississippi was busy trying to keep segregation alive. It was the front line for the civil rights movement, and not in a good way. Instead of stepping into the future, the state doubled down on the past, again, clinging to white supremacy like it was a family heirloom. This was the era of Medgar Evers, Freedom Summer, and the murder of Emmett Till, events that put Mississippi on the national map for all the wrong reasons. The state's response to the growing demand for civil rights was brutal and unapologetic. Peaceful protesters were met with violence, voting rights activists were beaten, jailed, or worse. Local law enforcement often worked hand in hand with white supremacist groups, and state officials turned a blind eye or gave it a quiet nod. The state government fought integration with every ounce of energy it could muster. Public schools were closed rather than allow black children to sit next to white ones. Segregation academies popped up overnight. Funding for black schools was laughable. Imagine trying to teach kids with hand-me-down textbooks from the 1930s or earlier in buildings that should have been condemned in the 1930s or earlier. Meanwhile, investment in the future, minimal. Mississippi poured its resources into resisting change rather than embracing progress. The economy stagnated, and the culture became one of deep-rooted fear. Fear of integration, fear of federal intervention, fear of losing the rigid social order that kept things predictable. For white people, at least. The brain drain began in earnest. Anyone with ambition, education, or even just common sense, especially black Mississippians, saw the writing on the wall and they packed their bags. They left for cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Los Angeles, where opportunities actually existed and where their lives might be worth more than a vote and a grave marker. And when those folks left, they took a lot of talent and potential with them. The rest of the country was dealing with oil crisis, inflation, and disco. Mississippi was still stuck in an economic version of Groundhog Day. The economy was a sluggish mix of agriculture, low-wage factory work, and government assistance. The state continued to rank dead last in almost every measurable category: poverty, education, healthcare, infrastructure, and life expectancy. It was like the world's worst bingo card. The bingo card of suffering is what it was. Education spending back then, still bottom of the barrel. Job growth, what growth? And public health, let's just say if you had a health emergency, your best bet was to head over the state line. They made it to the 90s finally. And by the time the 90s rolled around, Mississippi had a few bright spots: casinos along the Gulf Coast, some manufacturing, and attempts to improve the public school system. These were all heading in the right direction. But for every step forward, there were 2 steps backwards. The economy remained stagnant, with much of the state still dependent on agriculture and government aid. Tech boom? Not in Mississippi. Globalization? That just meant even more manufacturing jobs were leaving. Then came Hurricane Katrina in 2005. While Louisiana got most of the media attention, Mississippi's Gulf Coast was obliterated too. Cities like Biloxi, Gulfport took a direct hit, and recovery was painfully slow. Instead of bouncing back, Mississippi just kind of sat there, wondering where the help went. Welcome to the era of where'd all the young people go? The 2010s saw a population decline in many rural areas as people, especially those under 30, left for better jobs and lives elsewhere. Mississippi continued to rank 50th in education outcomes, median household income, and economic opportunity. The opioid crisis didn't help. Neither did the continued underfunding of public services. Schools closed, hospitals shut down, broadband internet was barely a thing, and it was like the 20th century showed up and Mississippi said, "No thanks, we're full, we got it from here." And let's talk about the job market, or rather, the lack of one. Unless you had dreams of working in poultry processing, a gas station, or becoming the assistant manager at your local Dollar Tree, your options were limited. High paying industries, they went elsewhere. Startups and tech companies never even considered Mississippi. The state essentially handed its young people a map and said, pick a direction, anywhere but here. And they did. College grads left in droves, and even high schoolers started planning their escape before they collected their diplomas. Long before, like eighth grade. Civic life wasn't much better. Small town governments struggled to stay afloat, and entire communities started to feel like ghost towns with a Walmart and a vape shop. Churches tried to keep morale up, but you can't pray your way into infrastructure improvements or Medicaid expansion. The state's leadership kept doubling down on tax cuts and culture wars, pretending like job fairs and internet access were optional luxuries instead of modern necessities. The end result? A brain drain of historic proportion and an aging, increasingly poor population left holding the bag. Then came COVID-19, which hit poor states hardest. And Mississippi was already playing the game on expert mode. The pandemic didn't just expose the cracks in the system, it bulldozed through them like a freight train. Suddenly, everyone saw what Mississippians had been living with for decades: underfunded hospitals, a gutted public health system, and a workforce hanging on by a thread. Hospitals were overwhelmed almost immediately. In many rural counties, there were no ICU beds, no backup plans, and in some cases, no hospitals at all. Nurses and doctors were stretched so thin that they were treating patients in hallways and waiting rooms. Entire communities were forced to drive hours for cares if they had access to transportation. If you didn't have insurance, good luck. You were either praying not to get sick or just hoping your symptoms weren't serious enough to warrant a second mortgage. Vaccination rates lagged badly, thanks to a deadly combination of misinformation, distrust of the government, and poor public outreach. Some counties had rates so low it looked like they were actively competing for last place. Public health officials pleaded for help, but state leaders often responded with more concern over mask mandates than actual lives. While other states launched coordinated campaigns to get shots in arms, Mississippi handed out a mixed message and watched the virus tear through the population, especially among the elderly and those in poverty. And as for the economy, recovery was more of a rumor than a reality. Small businesses shuttered permanently, tourism evaporated, low-wage workers who made up a massive chunk of the state's employed were either laid off or put in harm's way without hazard pay or benefits. Federal aid came and went, but without long-term investment in infrastructure, healthcare, or education, the money was a band-aid on a bullet wound. Mississippi didn't bounce back. It limped forward, slower and more broken than ever before, while the rest of the country tried to move on. By 2025, Mississippi had the highest poverty rate in the country, over 19% almost every single month. The lowest median household income, which two people earning in a house, they were making $52,000 or less. The worst public school outcomes, especially in rural districts, high rates of obesity, diabetes, and preventable deaths, a job market focused on low-wage industries like poultry processing and dollar stores. And don't forget the political leadership, which, let's be honest, seems to have taken its job description from a cable news comment section. While Mississippi's roads crumbled, hospitals closed, and classrooms begged for basic supplies, the folks in charge were trying to win the most out-of-touch state legislature award. Spoiler alert, they're running unopposed. Instead of passing bills to expand Medicaid or bring broadband internet to rural communities, they've been laser focused on banning books. That's right, libraries, schools, reading lists, and anything written after the 1980s had apparently become public enemy number one. And then there's the ongoing obsession with culture war distractions, whether it's policing what teachers say about history, arguing over who uses which bathroom, or trying to regulate drag shows like it's a national security threat. Mississippi lawmakers seem more interested in scoring ideological points than solving the literal decade-long issues plaguing their state. Meanwhile, teachers are underpaid, infrastructure projects are underfunded, and economic development plans usually involve prey and a dollar store shows up. It's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, except the ship sank a century ago, and they're still arguing over who caused the iceberg. You want to fix Mississippi? Maybe start by electing leaders who care more about potholes and poverty than banning To Kill a Mockingbird. Until that happens, it's all just a bad rerun that never gets canceled. All right, that's today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you got some information on this one. Everybody have a great day. Be nice to each other.